Stop using willpower. Use this instead. The myth you were sold. There is a story you've been told so many times, in so many different forms, that it stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like reality. The story goes like this. The people who succeed are the ones who want it more, who push harder, who feel the resistance and override it through sheer force of will. And the people who fail, who start and stop, who build routines that collapse, who know exactly what they should do and still don't do it. They fail because they don't have enough of that force. Because somewhere inside them something is weak. You've probably applied that story to yourself more times than you can count. And the cruelest part of it is not that it's entirely false, it's that it's just true enough to keep you trying the same thing, to keep you reaching for more force when the force runs out, to keep you interpreting every collapse as evidence of a personal deficiency rather than a systemic problem. But here is what that story never asks you to look at. Look at the people in your life, or in history, or in any serious account of human behavior, who have genuinely changed, not performed change, not maintained a streak for 90 days and called it transformation, actually changed in the deep and durable way that reorganizes how a person moves through the world. The people who built something real and sustained it, who don't seem to be fighting themselves every morning just to function. Watch them closely enough, and you notice something that the willpower narrative cannot explain. They don't look like they're forcing themselves. Not in the way you force yourself. Not with the visible strain, the constant internal negotiation, the daily decision to override the part of them that wants to stop. They move differently. There's a quality of coherence to it, as if the action and the person are pointing in the same direction, rather than the person dragging the action behind them through resistance. The willpower narrative looks at those people and says, they have more of what you have. Better version, same mechanism. But that's not what's happening. They're not using a stronger version of the tool you're using. They're using a different tool entirely. And the fact that it looks effortless from the outside is not because effort is absent. It's because the effort is no longer fighting the person making it. It's moving with them instead of against them. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. Because if you believe the people who succeed simply have more willpower, then the solution is always the same. Try harder, build more grit, find more force. And you will keep arriving at the same place, depleted, confused, and one more failure deeper into the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with you. But if the mechanism is different, if consistency doesn't actually come from force at all, then the entire strategy needs to change, not the effort. The source of the effort. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in the Meditations that most people read as a reminder to work hard. But read carefully, it's something else entirely. He wasn't reminding himself to push harder. He was reminding himself of what he actually valued, so that the action would arise from that clarity rather than from compulsion. He understood, with a precision that still feels modern, that a man who has to force himself towards something every day has not yet understood why it matters to him. And a man who doesn't understand why something matters to him cannot sustain it. Not really. Not in the way that builds something worth having. So the question this video is actually asking is not how to get more willpower. It's what the people who don't need it are using instead. And the answer is not what the industry wants to sell you. It's older, quieter, and considerably more demanding. But it works in a way that force never did. What willpower actually is. Nobody tells you what willpower actually is. They tell you to have more of it, to build it, to protect it, to use it wisely. But the actual mechanism, what it is, how it works, and why it is structurally unsuited to be the primary engine of a human life, that part almost never makes it into the conversation. Willpower is an override system. That's not a metaphor. That's a functional description of what happens in the brain when you exercise what we call willpower. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for long-term reasoning, consequence evaluation, and impulse inhibition, temporarily overrides a signal coming from a deeper, faster, more automatic part of the system. It says, I see what you want. We're not doing that right now. That override is real, it's measurable, and it is expensive. Every act of willpower draws from a finite cognitive reservoir, not infinitely, not proportionally. It draws from the same pool regardless of the size of the override. Resisting the snack and resisting the impulse to quit a project you've worked on for months. Different magnitudes, Same system, same cost. By the time you've exercised enough overrides to get through the first half of your day, the second half is already running on a depleted system. This is not weakness, this is architecture. And here is where the problem becomes structural rather than personal. Because willpower was never designed to be a daily operating system. It was designed to be an emergency response. The kind of mechanism that activates when something unexpected threatens your long-term direction, and you need to override the immediate impulse to protect something that matters more. Used in that way, it works. Used occasionally, deliberately, in genuine moments of conflict between short-term desire and long-term value. It does exactly what it was built to do. But that is not how most people use it. Most people wake up and immediately begin spending willpower on getting out of bed, on not checking the phone, on eating the right thing, on starting the work they've been avoiding, on staying focused, on not reacting to the person who irritates them, on maintaining the habit they committed to 3 weeks ago and have been forcing themselves through ever since. By noon, the system is running low. By evening, it's running on fumes. And then they look at the collapsed routine, the abandoned commitment, the choice they made that they knew was wrong, and they conclude that they simply don't have enough willpower. But the problem was never the quantity. The problem was the application. You were using an emergency system as infrastructure. An infrastructure built from emergency responses doesn't hold. It can't. It was never designed to. The Stoics observed this pattern in the men around them with remarkable precision. Not in neurological language, but in behavioral terms. They watched men of apparent discipline and inner fragility, men who performed self-control through enormous effort and fell apart the moment the structure supporting that effort was removed. And they made a distinction that almost nobody makes today. There is a difference between a man who controls himself and a man who no longer needs to control himself in the same way, because the nature of his perception has changed. The first man is running on willpower. The second man has built something underneath it. And the question that follows from that distinction, the one the Stoics spent considerable effort answering, is not how to have more willpower. It's what that something underneath actually is, and what it costs to build it, because there is a cost, a specific one. And it begins with understanding what using force as your primary mechanism has already taken from you. The hidden cost of running on force. There is a cost to running on willpower that nobody puts on the spreadsheet. Not the burnout, though burnout is real and it comes usually at the worst possible moment, disguised as apathy or sudden disinterest in things that used to matter. Not the collapsed routine, though that comes too reliably, usually around week 3 or 4 when the initial momentum fades, and what's left is the raw weight of forcing yourself through something your system never fully accepted. Those costs are visible. You've probably felt them. You know what it looks like when the structure collapses. The cost that concerns the Stoics, and the one that is genuinely harder to recover from, is something quieter. It's what happens to a man's relationship with his own interior when forcing becomes his default mode of operation. Here is how it happens. When you repeatedly override your own impulses through force, not because the impulse is wrong, but because you've decided that force is the mechanism, you gradually stop examining whether the impulse was worth overriding in the first place. You start treating all resistance as the enemy, all hesitation as weakness, all internal signal as noise to be suppressed rather than information to be examined. And over time you lose access to the signal entirely. Seneca writes about this in the letters to Lucilius with a specificity that is almost uncomfortable to read. He describes a man who has spent so long performing correct behavior, forcing compliance with his own standards, that he has lost the ability to distinguish between what he genuinely values and what he has simply trained himself to produce. He confuses the performance with the conviction. He mistakes effort for integrity. And then one day he looks inward for guidance, for the signal that tells him what matters, what direction to move, what is worth the cost, and finds only silence. Not because the signal was never there, because he overrode it so many times that it stopped offering itself. You probably know what this feels like in smaller form. The moment mid-task when you realize you have no idea why you're doing what you're doing, only that you decided you should. The evening where you've been productive by every external measure and feel completely empty. The conversation where someone asks what you actually want and you find the question genuinely difficult to answer. These are not signs of laziness. They are signs of a navigation system that has been systematically ignored until it stopped reporting. Marcus Aurelius understood this danger intimately. The Meditations, read carefully, are not primarily a guide to discipline. They are a sustained daily effort to keep the interior alive, to maintain access to genuine perception in the middle of enormous external demands. He wasn't writing to motivate himself. He was writing to keep hearing himself clearly, because he understood that a man who loses that clarity doesn't become undisciplined. He becomes something more dangerous, disciplined in the wrong direction, with no internal instrument left to tell him so. This is the real cost. Not the failed habits, not the depleted willpower. The gradual erosion of your own capacity to know what matters to you, and to trust that knowledge when it speaks. And here is the uncomfortable implication of that cost. If willpower, used as a primary mechanism, eventually silences the very signal that could show you the right direction, then more willpower is not the solution. It never was. The solution requires something the willpower narrative has no language for, something the Stoics called by a specific name, something that operates at a completely different level than force, and something that, once understood, makes the question of willpower almost beside the point. What the Stoics used instead. Stop for a moment and consider what you've actually been trying to do. Every time you reach for willpower, every time you grit your teeth and override the resistance and force yourself through another day of doing what you believe you should do, you are trying to change the output without changing the source. You are trying to produce different behavior from the same internal state that generated the behavior you're trying to replace. And it works, for a while. Sometimes for long enough that you believe it's working permanently, but the source hasn't changed. The internal state, the perception, the values, the way you see yourself and what matters, is still exactly what it was before you started forcing. And a source that hasn't changed will eventually reassert itself, not dramatically, not with a visible crisis, just quietly, reliably, in the gradual erosion of the behavior you were forcing until there's nothing left of it. This is not a motivational observation. It is a description of how systems work. The Stoics understood this with a clarity that took Western psychology nearly 2 millennia to rediscover. And what they used instead of willpower was not a more efficient version of force, it was a fundamentally different point of intervention. They intervened at the level of perception. In Stoic philosophy, every action begins with what Epictetus calls phantasia, the impression. The way a situation presents itself to the mind before the mind decides how to respond, before the impulse, before the desire, before the resistance. There is a moment, brief, often invisible, in which reality is interpreted, in which the mind assigns meaning, value, and implication to what it encounters. That moment is where the Stoics worked, not on the behavior, on the impression that generated the behavior. And this leads to a distinction that is worth sitting with, because it is more precise than anything the willpower conversation typically produces. The Stoics separated horme, the natural impulse that arises when perception is aligned with genuine values, from orexis, the desire that arises from unexamined impressions, from habit, from what we've been conditioned to want rather than what we've chosen to want. Willpower operates on orexis. It suppresses the unexamined desire through force, and the desire remains suppressed, not dissolved, waiting. Horme doesn't need to be suppressed. When a man's perception is genuinely aligned with what he values, when he sees clearly what something costs and what it builds, when his actions are coherent with his understanding of who he is, the impulse toward right action arises naturally. Not effortlessly, but naturally, without the internal war that willpower requires. Marcus Aurelius describes this in the Meditations not as inspiration, but as the result of a specific practice, a daily, deliberate return to what he actually believed, what mattered, what was under his control, what kind of man he intended to be that day. Not to generate enthusiasm, to generate orientation. And orientation sustained over time changes the source, it changes the impression, it changes what the mind sees when it encounters the moment of choice. This is ascesis, the Stoic practice of deliberate self-examination and realignment, not punishment, not deprivation. A precise, recurring act of returning to what you actually value. so that the gap between your perception and your behavior becomes visible and closable through understanding rather than force. The reason this is more demanding than willpower is not that it requires more effort. It's that it requires more honesty. Willpower lets you avoid the question of whether you're moving in the right direction. You're too busy forcing yourself to ask. Ascesis requires you to stop and look, to examine the impression before acting on it, to ask whether what you're about to do or force yourself to do actually reflects what you believe matters. That question is uncomfortable. It always has been, because sometimes the honest answer is no, and a no examined clearly is infinitely more useful than a yes forced through gritted teeth. But knowing the mechanism exists is not the same as knowing how to build it, because there is an architecture to natural action, a specific structure of perception, identity, and practice that makes Horme possible rather than accidental. And most people have never been shown what that architecture actually looks like. The architecture of natural action. There is a reason Marcus Aurelius began every day the same way, not with a motivational ritual, not with a recitation of goals or a visualization of outcomes. He began by orienting himself, by returning deliberately and without drama to a small set of questions that functioned less like inspiration and more like calibration. What kind of man do I intend to be today? What is actually under my control? What do I genuinely value in this specific situation I'm about to face? These questions were not designed to make him feel ready. They were designed to make him see clearly. And that distinction between feeling ready and seeing clearly is the difference between a man running on willpower and a man running on something more durable. Feeling ready is an emotional state. It comes and goes. It depends on sleep, on circumstance, on whether the previous day went well or badly. A strategy built on feeling ready will be consistent on good days and collapse on difficult ones, which means it will collapse precisely when it matters most. Seeing clearly is a different kind of resource. It doesn't require a particular emotional state. It requires practice, the specific recurring practice of returning to what you actually believe before you act. And what that practice builds over time is not motivation. It is something the Stoics valued far more: coherence. The state in which what you do and who you are point in the same direction. When coherence is present, action doesn't require force. It requires only consistency with the direction you've already chosen. The effort is real. Coherence doesn't eliminate difficulty, but it is clean effort, proportional. It moves with you rather than against you. And it builds rather than depletes. Epictetus describes this architecture in the Discourses with unusual precision for a philosophical text. He argues that the man who struggles most with consistent action is not the man who lacks willpower. It is the man whose prohairesis, his faculty of reasoned choice, has not been properly oriented. His choices are not arising from a clear, examined understanding of what he values. They are arising from habit, from social pressure, from the accumulated weight of unexamined impressions. And a choice that doesn't arise from genuine understanding cannot be sustained by force alone, not indefinitely. Because force is fighting the source, not changing it. The architecture of natural action has three components, not steps, components. They work together, not in sequence. The first is clarity of values, not as an abstract exercise, but as a living, regularly examined understanding of what actually matters to you and why. Not what should matter. What does? The distinction is critical, and most people have never sat with it long enough to feel the difference. The second is identity alignment, the coherence between the values you've examined and the way you see yourself. Not the person you're trying to become, the person you've decided you are. Epictetus is unusually direct about this in the Enchiridion. Behavior follows identity, with far more reliability than it follows intention. A man who intends to be disciplined will exhaust himself forcing discipline. A man who understands himself as someone for whom this action is simply consistent with who he is, that man has a different relationship with the effort entirely. The third is environmental orientation, the deliberate structuring of your daily context to reduce the distance between your values and your automatic behavior, not to eliminate choice, but to make the right choice the one that requires the least override. Marcus Aurelius did this every morning in the Meditations. He reduced the distance between his values and his perception of the day ahead, so that the gap willpower would have needed to bridge was already smaller before the day began. Together, these three components produce something that willpower never could, a system that regenerates rather than depletes. That gets easier with practice rather than harder. That doesn't depend on emotional state or circumstance to function. But there is a layer beneath all of this, one that determines whether any of it will actually work. One that most people skip entirely because it is the most uncomfortable part of the process. It has to do with who you believe you are, and whether that belief was ever actually chosen. The identity beneath the behavior. Here is the part of this conversation that willpower cannot reach. You can override an impulse. You can suppress a desire. You can force a behavior long enough that it starts to look like a habit from the outside. But there is one thing willpower cannot do. No matter how much of it you have, no matter how skillfully you deploy it, it cannot change what you believe about yourself. And what you believe about yourself determines everything that willpower is trying to fix. This is not a psychological abstraction. It is a precise, observable mechanism. The beliefs a man holds about his own identity, who he is, what he's capable of, what kind of person does the thing he's trying to do, function as a filter through which every experience passes. Every success is interpreted through that filter. Every failure, every moment of resistance, every morning when the alarm goes off and the question of whether to push or stop arises. If the filter says, "I'm someone who has to force himself to do this," then every act of forcing confirms the filter. The evidence accumulates. The identity calcifies. And willpower applied in that context is not building anything. It is reinforcing a self-conception that makes the behavior permanently difficult. Epictetus addresses this in the Enchiridion with a directness that is almost jarring. He argues that the foundation of all human behavior is prohairesis, the faculty of reasoned choice. Not the choices themselves, the faculty. The capacity for intentional, examined decision-making that arises from a clear understanding of what you value and who you are. When prohairesis is properly oriented, when a man has done the work of examining his values and aligning his self-conception with them, action flows from that orientation the way a river flows from its source. With force, yes, with effort, yes, but with direction, with coherence. Without the constant internal war of a man fighting himself. When prohairesis is corrupted, when a man acts from unexamined beliefs, inherited identities, values that were absorbed rather than chosen, no amount of willpower compensates. Because he is not fighting an impulse, he is fighting a story about who he is, and stories about identity are not overridable by force. They can only be replaced by other stories, ones that have been examined, chosen, and practiced into reality. Marcus Aurelius understood this. The Meditations are at their deepest level an identity document, not a diary, not a motivational text, a daily practice of deciding with clarity and precision who he was, so that his actions could arise from that decision rather than from the chaos of unexamined impulse. He didn't ask, "How do I force myself to be a good emperor today?" He asked, "What does it mean to be the kind of man I have chosen to be? And what does that man do in this specific situation?" The second question doesn't require willpower in the same way. It requires something harder and more permanent, the honest examination of who you've decided to be, and the daily practice of returning to that decision before acting. This is where the alternative to willpower actually lives, not in a technique, not in a system, in the slow, uncomfortable, deeply necessary work of examining what you believe about yourself and replacing what was inherited with what has been genuinely chosen. That work is not glamorous. It doesn't look like discipline from the outside. It looks like a man sitting quietly with a hard question for longer than is comfortable, until the honest answer begins to surface. But the man who does that work, consistently, unglamorously, without waiting for motivation, eventually finds that the actions he used to force have become simply consistent with who he is. And consistency with identity doesn't require willpower. It just requires knowing, clearly and without flinching, who you've decided to be. Which brings us to the only practical question left. Not what to believe, not what identity to choose, but where specifically you begin and what the Stoics actually did in practice on an ordinary day to build the kind of clarity that made willpower almost beside the point. Where to begin? The Stoic alternative in practice. There is no system at the end of this video, Not because practical tools are useless, they aren't, but because arriving at this point and handing you a 5-step framework would be doing exactly what this entire conversation has argued against. It would be giving you a new layer of structure to place over an interior that hasn't yet been examined. And structure placed over an unexamined interior doesn't hold. You already know this, you've lived it. So instead, here is where you actually begin. Not with a new habit, not with a better morning routine. With a question, one question asked honestly, about the area of your life where willpower has failed you most consistently. Not the area where you've been laziest. The area where you've tried hardest and kept arriving at the same place. Where the effort has been real, and the result has been the same collapse, the same reset. The same quiet accumulation of evidence that something isn't working. The question is this: what do I actually believe about myself in relation to this? Not what you want to believe. Not what you think you should believe. What you actually believe. Underneath the effort, underneath the narrative of the person you're trying to become. Because that belief, whatever it is the source. And the source is what willpower has been trying to override without ever touching. Marcus Aurelius didn't begin his mornings by trying to feel ready. He began by looking clearly at what he believed, about the day ahead, about his own nature, about what kind of man he had chosen to be. He did this not because it was inspiring, but because he understood that a man who doesn't examine his beliefs before acting will always be governed by beliefs he never chose. That examination is prosoph, attention to oneself, not endless self-analysis, not introspection as avoidance, a specific, brief, recurring act of returning to what you actually believe and asking whether those beliefs are ones you've examined and chosen or ones you've simply inherited and never questioned. Here is what that looks like in practice. Before you reach for willpower tomorrow, before you try to force yourself through the resistance one more time, stop for 5 minutes. Not to motivate yourself, not to visualize the outcome, to look at what you believe about yourself in relation to what you're about to do. Ask, is the person I believe myself to be someone for whom this action is natural, or someone who has to fight himself to produce it? And if the answer is the second, if the belief underneath the behavior is that you are fundamentally someone who struggles with this, then understand that willpower will never fix that. Because willpower is fighting the symptom. The belief is the source. The Stoic practice is not to override the belief with force. It is to examine it, to ask where it came from, to ask whether it was ever actually chosen, or whether it was assembled from old evidence, early experiences, the accumulated conclusions of a younger version of you who was working with incomplete information. And then slowly, deliberately to begin replacing it, not through affirmation, not through positive thinking, through action that is consciously chosen from a different self-conception, and repeated often enough that the new belief has evidence of its own. Epictetus calls this the work of proheresis, the daily unglamorous exercise of bringing your faculty of choice into alignment with what you've genuinely decided to value. It doesn't happen in a single morning. It doesn't produce a dramatic shift you can point to. It produces something quieter and considerably more durable, a gradually increasing coherence between who you believe you are and what you actually do. And when that coherence reaches a certain threshold, when the gap between identity and behavior becomes small enough, something shifts that no act of willpower ever produced. The action stops feeling like forcing. Not because it becomes easy, because it becomes consistent with who you are. And a man acting consistently with who he is doesn't experience that as effort in the same way. He experiences it as direction, as movement, as the particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from overcoming yourself, but from finally moving with yourself instead of against. That is what the Stoics were pointing toward. Not a harder life, not more grit, a more examined one. A life in which the source of action has been looked at clearly enough that force becomes the exception rather than the rule. Stop reaching for more willpower. Start examining what's underneath it. That's where the real work has always been. And if something in this video landed in a way that felt less like information and more like recognition, if you found yourself nodding not because the ideas were new, but because some part of you already knew this and needed to hear it said clearly, then you already know what the next step is. It's not a new system. It's not a new routine. It's 5 minutes tomorrow morning before the forcing begins with one honest question. Ask it. Stay with it long enough to feel the discomfort of a real answer. That's the beginning. And if you've stayed until here, through all of it, then you already have more than most people allow themselves. So if this meant something to you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below. I read every single one by one. Because more often than not, the next video starts there. In what you share, in the things you're carrying that almost nobody manages to put into words. And maybe the most important thing about this channel is exactly that. The quiet recognition that you are not the only one asking these questions in silence. Thank you for being here, for your attention, for the time you chose to spend here today. See you in the next one.